Imagine a city in the middle of America. Not New York, not Los Angeles, not the kind of city that appears in movies or makes the front page of international newspapers. Omaha, Nebraska, a flat, windswept, meat-packing city on the Missouri River, where the winters are brutal and the summers are punishing, and the people are, by and large, the kind of people who do not believe in showing off. Where a handshake means something. Where a dollar saved is worth more than a dollar spent. Where the very air seems to carry a certain Midwestern pragmatism, a deep-seated suspicion of anything too flashy, too fast, too good to be true. This is where the greatest investor in the history of human civilization was born. This is where he still lives. And this, when you understand it properly, is not an accident. It is the first clue. August 30th, 1930. The Great Depression is eating America alive. Banks are failing at a rate that would have seemed unimaginable 2 years earlier. Unemployment is climbing toward 25%. Breadlines stretch around city blocks. The stock market, that glorious carnival ride stock market that had made so many people feel so wealthy through the roaring 20s, has lost 89% of its value. 89%. Families who had borrowed money to buy stocks at the height of the boom are now destroyed. Banks that had lent that money are now destroyed. The entire financial architecture of the most powerful economy on earth is crumbling. And into this wreckage, in a house on Dunlap Avenue in Omaha, Nebraska, a boy is born. His father is Howard Buffett, a quiet, principled man who works as a stockbroker in the middle of the worst stock market collapse in history, who will go on to serve 4 terms in the United States Congress as a conservative Republican from Nebraska, who believes with absolute conviction in individual liberty and hard money and the God-given right of every American to make his own choices and live with their consequences. His mother is Layla Stahl, brilliant, sharp-tongued, prone to volcanic emotional storms that could reduce her children to tears and leave the household walking on eggshells for days. She loved her children. She also terrified them, regularly and without apparent remorse. Warren Edward Buffett arrives in the middle of the American catastrophe, and he will spend the next 90-plus years turning the lesson of that catastrophe. The lesson that assets have real value independent of their market price, that panic is opportunity, that patience is not a passive virtue, but an active and extraordinarily profitable one, into the greatest personal fortune ever accumulated by a single human being through investment alone. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because the story of Warren Buffett does not begin with stocks. It begins with something far more fundamental. It begins with numbers. He was obsessed with numbers before he could properly explain what an obsession was. At age 6, he was selling chewing gum door to door in his neighborhood, not whole packs, but individual sticks, because he had already grasped the concept of margin. He had figured out that if you bought a pack of 5 sticks for a nickel and sold each stick for 2 cents, you made a profit on every pack, but only if you sold each stick individually, because no customer was going to pay a full nickel for a stick they could buy for 2 cents. He tracked his sales. He remembered the numbers. He was 6 years old, and he was already, instinctively, thinking like a businessman. At 7, he got sick and spent time in the hospital. His father brought him books. Not children's stories, numbers books. A book called 1,000 Ways to Make $1,000 became his obsession. He read it until the pages were soft with handling. He memorized it. He dreamed about it. The ideas in that book planted themselves in his mind and grew, silently and steadily, into a root system of financial intuition so deep and so tangled that it would eventually be impossible to say where the book ended and Warren Buffett began. At 8 years old, he began reading every book about the stock market in the Omaha Public Library, not glancing at them, reading them, cover to cover, making notes, asking questions. His father, Howard, would bring him to his office at the brokerage on Saturdays, and young Warren would sit in the corner and watch the men watching the ticker tape. That endless ribbon of paper chattering out the prices of stocks traded hundreds of miles away in New York, and he would feel something that he could not quite name, but that was entirely, precisely, unmistakably what he would one day describe as love. There is a particular kind of child, rare, slightly unnerving to adults who encounter them, impossible to fully understand until decades have passed and the shape of their life has made everything obvious in retrospect, who seems to arrive in the world already knowing what they are for. Not what they want to do for a job, not what career path seems sensible, but what they are for. What specific activity, when they are doing it, makes the world feel properly ordered and alive in a way that nothing else quite matches. For some it is music. For some it is mathematics. For some it is the physical world of sport or craft. For Warren Buffett, it was commerce. It was the transaction, the exchange, the quantification of value, and the negotiation of its transfer. He was not merely interested in money. He was interested in what money represented, which was, at its most fundamental level, a score. A precise, unambiguous, constantly updated measure of how well you were understanding the world and acting on that understanding. You could have 10 opinions about art or literature or philosophy, and none of them could be definitively proved or disproved. But you could have an opinion about the value of a business, and the market would eventually, not immediately, but eventually, tell you exactly how right or wrong you were. For a child who craved precision, who found the ambiguity of human emotion exhausting and the clarity of numbers consoling, this was not just an interest. It was a salvation. He fell in love with the market. Not the casino version of the market. Not the thrill of gambling. Not the rush of a quick profit. The deep, structural, mathematical reality of the market. The fact that every number on that ticker tape represented a real business, with real assets and real earnings, and a real intrinsic value that existed whether the market acknowledged it or not. The fact that the market, being made of human beings who were prone to panic and euphoria and all the other extremes of human emotion, regularly priced those businesses incorrectly, sometimes too high, but far more usefully, sometimes far too low. The fact that if you were patient and rational and disciplined, you could simply wait for the market to be irrational, by what it was irrationally selling, and wait again until it corrected itself, and then collect the difference. This idea, simple, elegant, almost absurdly obvious once you understood it, was not actually widely understood in 1938. The dominant theories of investment at the time were either purely speculative or purely intuitive. Most professionals in the financial industry made their decisions based on tips, rumors, hunches, relationships, and the kind of vague market mysticism that dressed itself in the language of expertise without ever providing the substance of it. The man who changed all of that was not Warren Buffett. It was a Columbia University professor named Benjamin Graham, and when Buffett eventually found his work, the effect was not gradual or subtle. It was, as Buffett himself would later describe it, like finding a religious text, like having the architecture of the universe suddenly revealed to you on a single afternoon. But that discovery was still years away. First, there was the hustle. Because even as a child, Warren Buffett was not merely theorizing about money. He was making it. At 11 years old, he bought his first stock, 3 shares of Citi's Service Preferred, at $38 a share, using money he had saved from his various enterprises. He bought 3 shares for his sister Doris as well. The stock immediately dropped to $27. Doris let him know about this regularly. Then the stock climbed back to $40. Warren sold. He made a tiny profit. He felt, briefly, satisfied. Then Citi's Service Preferred climbed to $200 a share. This moment, this particular, excruciating, formative experience of selling too early, of taking a tiny profit while a large one sat just a little bit further along the timeline, burned itself into Warren Buffett's memory so deeply that it became one of the foundational principles of everything he did afterward. Patience. Not just intellectual patience, not just knowing. In theory, that you should hold your investments for the long term. Physical, emotional, visceral patience. The ability to sit with a stock that had already appreciated and not sell it, because you understood that its intrinsic value was still higher than its market price, and that the gap between price and value would, eventually, close. This patience, this almost inhuman capacity to do nothing when doing something felt irresistible, would become the single most important competitive advantage of Warren Buffett's investing life. He moved on to other enterprises with characteristic energy. He bought a pinball machine for $25 and installed it in a barber shop, splitting the profits with the owner. Within months, he had 3 machines in 3 barber shops, generating steady income that he carefully tracked in a ledger he carried everywhere. He delivered newspapers, not one route, but multiple routes, sometimes delivering 500 papers a day, earning more in a single week than some of his teachers earned in a month. He sold used golf balls. He sold magazines. He sold anything, to anyone, with a cheerful, persistent, utterly relentless salesmanship that made people want to buy things from him even when they hadn't particularly wanted those things before he showed up at their door. The ledger. This detail matters. At an age when most children were spending whatever money came their way on candy and comics and movies, Warren Buffett was writing everything down. Every penny earned, every penny spent, every investment made. The discipline was not punishing, it was pleasurable. The numbers were company. The numbers made sense in a world that, in other respects, did not always make sense to a bookish, awkward, intensely internal boy who found social interaction more confusing and exhausting than any mathematical problem he had ever encountered. His mother's volatility scared him. His sister Doris bore the brunt of Layla's storms, and Warren watched and learned and retreated into numbers the way some children retreat into fantasy. Numbers did not shout. Numbers did not change their minds without warning. Numbers behaved according to rules that, once understood, could be trusted absolutely. This is not an incidental biographical detail. It is, arguably, the psychological foundation of everything that followed. His father, Howard, was the anchor, a man of deep integrity and genuine warmth, who brought his son to the office, who answered his questions with patience, who modeled the kind of public service ethic that Warren absorbed more thoroughly than his father perhaps realized. Howard Buffett was elected to Congress in 1942, and the family moved to Washington, D.C. Warren was miserable. He missed Omaha. He missed his friends, his routes, his routines, the particular geography of a city he had already mapped in his mind with the thoroughness of a general planning a campaign. He ran away, briefly, unsuccessfully, and with the resignation of a practical child who understood that certain battles were not yet his to win. But Washington gave him something. It put him in proximity to power at an early age and showed him how the machinery of the world actually operated, not through the idealistic civic education of schoolbooks, but through the backstage reality of political life, where deals were made and favors were traded, and the people who understood how systems worked were always more powerful than the people who merely operated within them. He also discovered, in Washington, a bookmaking operation at a racetrack. He was 14 years old. He went to the track, observed the bettors, bought discarded racing tip sheets from the floor, and analyzed them for patterns. He was not particularly interested in horses. He was interested in probability, in misvaluation, in the gap between what people believed and what the actual odds suggested. This is, in the most compressed possible form, the intellectual DNA of modern value investing. Warren Buffett was applying it to horse racing at 14. The family moved back to Omaha. And then, when Howard's congressional career required another Washington posting, Warren made a decision. He was not going back. He had, by this point, accumulated enough money from his various enterprises that he felt, with the confidence of a teenager who had been thinking about money his entire life, that he was capable of managing his own affairs. He stayed in Omaha, boarding with a family friend, finishing high school, running his paper routes, tending his pinball machine empire. By the time he graduated high school, Warren Buffett had accumulated approximately $6,000. This was 1947. $6,000 in 1947 is the equivalent of several times that amount in modern purchasing power, but more importantly, it represented something beyond mere currency. It represented the product of years of systematic, disciplined, entrepreneurial effort by a person who was, at 17, already thinking about money in ways that most adults never achieved in their entire lifetimes. He applied to Harvard Business School. He was rejected. The interviewer, meeting the short, unimpressive-looking, squirrely teenager from Nebraska, apparently could not project forward from the awkward boy in front of him to the kind of leader Harvard imagined its graduates becoming. It was, in retrospect, one of the most expensive rejection decisions any institution of higher learning has ever made. Instead, Warren enrolled at the University of Nebraska, finished his degree in 3 years, and then applied to Columbia University's graduate business program, specifically because he had read that Benjamin Graham taught there. And here, right here, is one of those moments in a story when you can feel the gears of history engaging, when you can sense that the narrative is about to shift to a fundamentally different register. Benjamin Graham was, in 1950, the most important figure in the history of modern investment theory. He had survived the crash of 1929, barely, having lost almost everything, and he had spent the 2 decades since formulating a rigorous, systematic approach to stock valuation that had nothing to do with tips or rumors or market sentiment, and everything to do with the actual financial reality of the underlying businesses. His book, The Intelligent Investor, published in 1949, was not a popular bestseller. It was dense, analytical, demanding. It required you to actually read financial statements, understand accounting, calculate intrinsic value from first principles. It was, in short, work. And because it was work, most people didn't do it, which meant that the insights it offered were available, in practice, only to the small minority of investors disciplined enough to apply them. When Warren Buffett read it, he felt, as he later described it, as if Benjamin Graham had written the book specifically for him, as if every word was an answer to a question he had been carrying since childhood, as if the entire framework of his financial intuition, the instinctive sense that the market's price and a business's value were 2 different things, had been formalized, proven, and handed to him as a complete operating system. He arrived at Columbia in the fall of 1950 with the energy of a man who has found his religion and the intellectual hunger of someone who has been waiting for this his entire life. Graham's seminars were legendarily demanding. Graham would take apart a company's financial statements in front of the class and ask students to value the business, not based on what the market was paying for it, but based on what its actual assets and earnings suggested it was worth. Most students struggled. Many found it dry, abstract, impossible to make interesting. Warren Buffett found it the most exciting thing he had ever done in his life. He was the only student Graham ever gave an A+. That is not a myth. That is the documented, recorded, eyewitness-attested fact. Benjamin Graham, in decades of teaching investment analysis at Columbia University, gave exactly 1 student the highest possible grade. That student sat in the front row, raised his hand constantly, challenged Graham's assumptions with respectful but relentless intellectual energy, and very clearly, very obviously, had been born for this particular intellectual discipline in a way that left everyone else in the room feeling like they were watching a different order of aptitude at work. Graham was so impressed that he offered Buffett a job at his investment partnership, Graham-Newman Corporation, after graduation. And Warren Buffett, who had by this point been in love with Benjamin Graham's ideas for years, who considered Graham a god figure, a father figure, an intellectual hero of the first order, accepted with the enthusiasm of someone who couldn't quite believe their luck. He was 21 years old. He was working for the man he admired most in the world. He was in New York City, the financial capital of the universe, learning the mechanics of professional investing from its greatest living practitioner. Everything was ahead of him. Everything was possible. He was, by his own account, profoundly unhappy. Not because the work was wrong, the work was everything. Not because Graham was disappointing, Graham was brilliant. But because New York was not Omaha, and Omaha was home, and home was where the woman he loved was waiting. Her name was Susan Thompson. He had met her in Omaha, through her father, a professor at the University of Omaha who was a friend of Howard Buffett's. She was warm, funny, socially at ease in ways that Warren was not, musically gifted, deeply empathetic. Everything that Warren was not, in the emotional and social registers of life, and everything that he needed in a partner precisely, because those qualities were so alien to him that he was not sure, without her, that he could navigate ordinary human experience at all. He proposed to her with the anxious directness of a man who had decided what he wanted and was willing to pay full price for it. She accepted. They married in April 1952. They moved to Omaha in 1956, after Warren had spent a few more years at Graham-Newman, learning everything there was to learn, and after Graham, approaching retirement, winding down the partnership, made it possible for Buffett to return home with both the knowledge and the confidence he needed to build something of his own. And what he built, in a converted bedroom in his house on Farnham Street in Omaha, was one of the most remarkable investment partnerships in the history of American finance. He started with 7 limited partners, family members, and close friends, each contributing different amounts, and his own $100. The total initial capital was $105,000. He was 25 years old. He was running an investment fund out of a bedroom in Nebraska. There was no office. There was no staff. There were no fancy Bloomberg terminals or algorithmic models or teams of analysts in expensive suits. There was Warren Buffett, a telephone, a pile of financial reports, and the framework of understanding he had built over the previous 20 years. The rules he set for the partnership were unusual by the standards of the investment industry. He would not tell his partners what stocks he owned. He would not tell them what his strategy was, beyond the general principle that he was looking for undervalued securities. He would measure his performance against the Dow Jones Industrial Average. If the market went up and he went up more, he was doing his job. If the market went down and he went down less, he was still doing his job. And he would charge fees only on profits above a certain threshold. He would take 25% of gains above 6% annually, with no fee at all on underperformance. This last point is worth pausing on. The typical investment manager of the era, and, frankly, of every era before and since, charged fees regardless of performance. You paid your 2% annually whether they beat the market or not, whether they made you rich or lost half your money. Buffett's structure aligned his interests perfectly with his partners. He got rich only if they got richer first. This alignment was not merely ethically pleasing. It was strategically brilliant. It meant his partners trusted him completely, gave him complete latitude, and stayed invested through periods of underperformance or uncertainty that would have caused a typical investor to panic and pull out. The trust he built through that fee structure gave him the most precious commodity in investing, time. He could be patient because his partners were patient, and they were patient because the structure he had built for them made patience rational. From the bedroom on Farnham Street, the partnership grew. Not explosively at first, steadily, methodically, the way things grow when they are genuinely sound rather than merely fashionable. He found stocks that the market was ignoring, small, obscure, financially solid companies whose assets were worth more than their market capitalization, companies that were essentially trading at a discount to the cash they held, companies that any rational person who looked at the numbers would immediately recognize as undervalued. He bought them. He waited. The market eventually agreed with his valuation. He collected the difference. One of his earliest major successes was a company called Sanborn Map. Sanborn made detailed maps of American cities for fire insurance companies. Extremely specific, extremely useful, and generating steady cash flow with essentially no competition. But Sanborn was also sitting on an investment portfolio worth significantly more than its entire market capitalization. The market was valuing the business at less than the value of its investments alone, which meant that the actual map business, profitable, established, with decades of reliable cash flows, was being priced at less than zero, less than nothing. This was the kind of situation that made Warren Buffett's pulse quicken. Not because it was exciting in the conventional sense, there was nothing glamorous about Sanborn Maps, but because the math was so clear, so unambiguous, so obviously correct, that acting on it felt less like a gamble and more like picking up money someone had dropped on the sidewalk. He accumulated enough shares that he was able to join the board and push for a restructuring that unlocked the value of the investment portfolio. The result was a substantial profit for his partners. He found similar situations repeatedly. Companies with hidden assets, companies priced below their liquidation value, companies that the market had forgotten or misunderstood or simply never paid attention to in the first place. He was doing what Graham had taught him, going where the crowd was not, finding value where others saw nothing, buying what was cheap and waiting with the serenity of a man who was absolutely certain he was right. But somewhere in the early 1960s, something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. More like the gradual change in the quality of light as the angle of the sun moves through a long afternoon. So slow you barely notice it, but unmistakable when you look back at where you started. Warren Buffett was meeting a man named Charlie Munger. Charles T. Munger was, and remains, one of the most formidable intellects in the history of American business. Born in Omaha, like Buffett, like a peculiar number of significant figures in this story, Munger had left for Harvard Law School and eventually settled in Los Angeles, where he was building a successful legal and investment career. He was introduced to Buffett through mutual friends in 1959 at a dinner in Omaha that neither man would ever forget. They talked for hours. They argued. They challenged each other with the competitive intellectual energy of two people who had been looking for a match their entire lives and had finally, unexpectedly, found one. Munger read more broadly than Buffett. He was a voracious consumer of psychology, history, biology, physics, everything, with the Catholic appetite of a man who believed that true understanding required models from every discipline, that the person who only thought in one framework was always going to be outmaneuvered by the person who could think in 12. He was also, by temperament, less patient than Buffett, quicker to act, quicker to judge, quicker to dismiss ideas that struck him as intellectually unworthy. He was funny in a razor-sharp way that could leave people unsure whether they had just been complimented or insulted. He and Buffett discovered in each other the rarest possible thing, a person whose thinking genuinely improved your own. Munger's central challenge to Buffett's Graham-derived framework was, in retrospect, transformative. Graham's method focused on buying cheap stocks trading below their intrinsic value, regardless of the quality of the underlying businesses. It was, in the most literal sense, a quantitative method. You calculated the numbers, and if the numbers said the stock was cheap enough, you bought it, full stop. The quality of the business, whether it had durable competitive advantages, whether its management was excellent, whether it would still be relevant in 20 years, these things mattered less to Graham than the current arithmetic of price versus value. Munger's argument was that this approach was too limited, that the really great returns in investing came not from buying mediocre businesses at wonderful prices, but from buying wonderful businesses at fair prices. That a truly exceptional business, one with genuine competitive advantages that would compound its earnings and its value for decades, was worth paying what seemed like a premium for, because the compounding math over a long enough time period made the initial premium irrelevant. That it was better to own a great business that kept getting better than a cheap business that stayed mediocre. This argument took years to penetrate Buffett's thinking fully. He was, by his own later admission, a slow convert. The Graham framework had made him wealthy and had made his partners wealthy, and it was very difficult to abandon something that was working. But the evidence accumulated, and Munger pressed, and eventually the shift happened, and when it did, it transformed Warren Buffett from a very good investor into the greatest investor who has ever lived. The clearest example of this transformation came in 1972 with a candy company in California called See's Candies. See's was, on the surface, an unexceptional business. It was a candy retailer primarily in the western United States, with a devoted customer base, a strong brand reputation, and very modest growth prospects. By the metrics Graham had taught, price relative to book value, price relative to tangible assets, it was not cheap. Buffett's instinct, shaped by years of Graham's influence, was that $25 million was too much to pay for a business with the balance sheet See's had. The assets simply did not justify the price. Munger argued differently. The real value of See's, he said, was not in its assets. It was in the brand. It was in the fact that customers had an emotional relationship with See's chocolates that made them essentially price insensitive. That See's could raise its prices every year without losing significant volume, because the experience of buying See's was about more than the candy itself. It was about the ritual of it, the memory of it, the way a box of See's chocolates meant something to the person giving it and the person receiving it that a generic box of chocolates simply could not replicate. This was not a commodity business. It was an emotional franchise. And emotional franchises, properly managed, were something entirely different from the cheap, overlooked, asset-rich, but business-poor situations that Graham had taught Buffett to haunt. They bought See's for $25 million. Over the following decades, See's Candies would generate over $2 billion in pre-tax earnings for Berkshire Hathaway, with minimal capital reinvestment required. Every dollar of earnings it generated could be taken out of the business and invested elsewhere, in other great businesses, at their own compounding rates of return. See's did not just make money. See's made money that made more money that made more money, in a cascade of compound returns that continued, year after year, long after everyone who remembered the original purchase decision had stopped being surprised by it. This was the lesson. Not just that See's was a great deal. That was obvious in retrospect. The lesson was conceptual. The lesson was that the quality of a business, its competitive mode, its pricing power, the emotional and practical loyalty of its customers, the durability of its advantages, was itself a quantifiable form of value, one that conventional accounting completely failed to capture and that conventional investment analysis therefore systematically underpriced. The moat was the asset. The brand was the balance sheet. The customer relationship was the financial statement that mattered most. Once Buffett fully internalized this, his investment decisions changed dramatically. He was no longer looking primarily at cheap stocks. He was looking for exceptional businesses, businesses with genuine competitive advantages that would compound over time, and he was willing to pay up for them. Not recklessly, never recklessly. The discipline of value, of not overpaying, of understanding what you were getting for your money, remained absolute. But the universe of what counted as a good investment expanded enormously. And within that expanded universe, some of the greatest businesses in American history were waiting to be owned. Washington Post Company. He began accumulating shares in 1973 when the market's broader decline had dragged the Post stock price down to a level that represented, by Buffett's calculation, roughly 1/4 of the business's intrinsic value. The Washington Post Company owned not just the newspaper but television stations, Newsweek magazine, and other media properties. The franchise was unassailable. The journalism was superb. The management, particularly Katharine Graham, who had taken over the company after her husband Phil's tragic death and was running it with a combination of personal courage and professional rigor that Buffett found deeply admirable, was excellent. He bought 10% of the company for roughly $10 million. Within a decade, that stake was worth $200 million. He would hold it for 4 decades. watching it compound with the serene patience of a man who understood, at a molecular level, that the only reason to sell a great business was if the price exceeded your estimate of its value by a margin too large to ignore. He and Katharine Graham became close friends. He taught her about finance with the same patient, clear-eyed enthusiasm that he had used since childhood to share his obsessions with anyone willing to listen. She trusted him. He advised her. It was one of those partnerships where two very different people, from very different worlds, discover that their differences are complementary in precisely the right ways, that one person's gaps are exactly where the other's strengths lie. It was around this time that Buffett also began transforming the vehicle through which he invested. In 1965, he had acquired control of a struggling New England textile company called Berkshire Hathaway. The story of how Berkshire came to be his, and why it is perhaps the most instructive mistake Warren Buffett ever made, is worth telling in full because it contains within it one of the most important financial lessons of the 20th century. Buffett had begun buying Berkshire shares in 1962 because it was cheap in the Graham sense. The stock was trading at less than the company's net working capital, meaning you were essentially getting the mills for free. He accumulated shares steadily. He started talking to the company's management, a man named Seabury Stanton, about a possible tender offer. They had what Buffett believed was a gentleman's agreement. Berkshire would offer to buy his shares at a certain price, and Buffett would accept. When the formal offer arrived, the price was 7/8 of a cent less than agreed. 7/8 of a cent. On a significant number of shares. Buffett was furious. Not because of the money, the amount was trivial. Because of the principle. Because Stanton had looked him in the eye and agreed to one thing and then done another. And Warren Buffett's response to this act of bad faith was, and he himself has acknowledged this, repeatedly, with the rueful honesty of a man who understands exactly when his ego cost him money, he doubled down. He bought enough Berkshire shares to take control of the company. He fired Stanton. He took over. And then he looked at what he owned. A struggling textile company in New Bedford, Massachusetts, producing fabric in mills that were being outcompeted by modern, lower-cost facilities in the American South and, increasingly, overseas. The economics of the business were terrible. Capital reinvestment was constant. Labor costs were high. Margins were thin. There was no durable competitive advantage. Fabric was fabric, and if someone else could produce it more cheaply, customers would buy from them. He was trapped in exactly the kind of business that all of his intellectual development had taught him to avoid, and he was trapped there because he had let a petty grievance override his analytical judgment. The textile business was, he would later admit, a mistake, a classic Graham-style cheap stock that turned out to be a value trap, a business cheap for very good reasons that no amount of good management could fully overcome. Textiles were being crushed by foreign competition, and no matter how efficiently you ran the mills, the economics of the industry were simply not good enough to generate the returns that Buffett needed. He later calculated that the decision to take over Berkshire rather than walk away from Stanton's trick had cost him, over time, somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 billion in lost compounding. $200 billion. Because of 7/8 of a cent. But Berkshire Hathaway itself, the corporate structure, the holding company chassis, was something he could repurpose. Instead of deploying Berkshire's capital back into the struggling textile business, he began investing it in great businesses elsewhere. Insurance companies first, National Indemnity Company in 1967, which gave him something extraordinarily valuable that most investors never have, float. When an insurance company collects premiums, it holds that money until claims are paid out. In the interim, it can invest that money. If the insurance business is well run, if claims are managed carefully, if the premiums collected exceed the claims paid, then the float is essentially free capital. You are being paid to hold money that you can then invest. Warren Buffett understood this mechanism with a clarity that transformed it from a technical insurance concept into the financial engine that would eventually power the greatest investment empire in history. He bought more insurance companies. Geico, the government employees' insurance company, became one of the great pillars of Berkshire's portfolio. Buffett had first encountered Geico as a young man, had actually ridden a train to Washington on a Saturday morning in 1951 to knock on the company's locked office door, because he had discovered that Benjamin Graham was on the board and he wanted to understand the business that his mentor had decided was worth owning. A janitor let him in. The vice president of finance, Lorimer Davidson, spent 4 hours talking to him about the Geico business model, and those 4 hours planted a seed that would blossom, 25 years later, into one of the great investment coups of the century. When Geico nearly went bankrupt in the mid-1970s, crushed by an expansion into poorly underwritten risks and the general turbulence of that troubled decade, Buffett moved. He began buying shares at between $2 and $7. Geico recovered. Berkshire eventually acquired the entire company in 1996. The returns were extraordinary. But the more important thing was the principle. Buy what is great when it is temporarily cheap, because the greatness will endure long after the cheapness has passed. Through the 1970s and 1980s, the Berkshire Hathaway story became one of the great compound interest machines in financial history. Every year, the earnings from the existing portfolio were reinvested into new opportunities. Every acquisition was chosen with the same disciplined, patient, emotionally detached rationality. Every business that Berkshire bought was expected to generate cash that could be deployed elsewhere. The entire structure was designed not as a conglomerate in the traditional sense, but as a compounding engine, a machine for turning money into more money at rates that exceeded what the market as a whole could achieve, year after year, decade after decade, without interruption. The results were, and remain, almost incomprehensible when you look at them clearly. Berkshire Hathaway stock in 1965 was trading at around $18 a share. By the 1990s, it was trading at tens of thousands of dollars. By the 2000s, hundreds of thousands. By the 2020s, over $500,000 for a single share. The kind of returns that made any normal financial calculator laugh and give up. The kind of returns that required new units of measurement. And through all of it, through every doubling and redoubling and re-redoubling of value, through every year when the financial press was asking whether the Buffett era was finally over, whether his methods were obsolete, whether the new economy had left the old master behind. Through all of it, Warren Buffett sat in the same office, in the same building, in the same city where he had been born. In Omaha, Nebraska, the office is, by the standards of a man worth hundreds of billions of dollars, almost deliberately unimpressive. It is on the 14th floor of Kiewit Plaza, a mid-century office building in downtown Omaha that would not attract a second glance from any passing tourist. The office itself has no Bloomberg terminal, no real-time stock ticker, no wall of screens displaying market data in real time. There is a desk and a telephone and a pile of financial reports and annual statements and newspapers and books. There is a cherry Coke. Always, invariably, a cherry Coke, because Buffett drinks cherry Coke with the dedication of a man who has found something he loves and sees no reason to vary it. There are framed photographs and mementos and the organized chaos of a mind that is always working, always processing, always turning data over in its interior machinery and producing judgments and valuations and insights that have made their owner one of the wealthiest and most admired people in the history of human civilization. He reads, "This is the part of the Buffett story that most people underestimate and almost nobody fully grasps." He reads with an intensity and a volume that would be unusual in an academic and is almost freakish in the context of someone also running a major corporation. 5 to 6 hours a day, every day, reading financial reports, newspapers, books, trade publications, anything that might yield an insight or a data point or a connection between two pieces of information that, separately, are unremarkable but together suggest something important. Charlie Munger reads even more. Their combined information consumption is, by any normal standard, staggering. But Buffett's reading is not passive. It is active in the deepest sense. He is not merely absorbing information. He is building a mental model of the world, continuously updated, that allows him to evaluate businesses with a speed and accuracy that trained analysts with teams of researchers and sophisticated financial models simply cannot match. He can read an annual report and, within the time it takes most people to locate the table of contents, have formed a preliminary judgment about the quality of the business, the integrity of the management, and whether the asking price is remotely connected to the underlying reality. This is not magic. It is the accumulated pattern recognition of a person who has been doing this relentlessly for 70 years. The annual report he writes for Berkshire shareholders is a document unlike any other in the corporate world. It is funny. It is self-deprecating. It admits mistakes with a candor that makes most corporate communications seem like exhibits in a museum of euphemism. It explains complex financial concepts in language so clear and accessible that a high school student could follow it. It is, over the decades, one of the great collections of financial wisdom available to any human being who wants to understand how to think about money and value and business and risk. MBA programs assign it. Fund managers memorize it. It is, in every meaningful sense, a masterwork of both communication and ideas, and it is written every year in Omaha, Nebraska, by a man sitting at a desk drinking cherry Coke. One of the most famous and most instructive episodes in the entire Buffett canon is the story of Salomon Brothers. In 1987, Berkshire Hathaway invested $700 million in Salomon Incorporated, the investment bank, in the form of convertible preferred stock, a preferred position that paid Berkshire a handsome yield and gave Buffett significant influence in the company's affairs. It was an unusual investment for Buffett. Investment banks were not the kind of durable competitive advantage businesses he typically favored, but the price was right and the yield was attractive and Buffett believed in the management. Then, in 1991, Salomon was rocked by a scandal. A rogue trader named Paul Moser had been submitting false bids in Treasury securities auctions, essentially cornering the market in violation of federal regulations. When the scandal broke, it threatened to destroy the company entirely. The government was considering revoking Salomon's license to operate as a primary dealer in Treasury securities, a death sentence for an investment bank. The CEO had resigned. The company was in free fall. Its stock was collapsing. Its clients were fleeing. Its employees were terrified. Warren Buffett, who had more money at risk in Salomon than perhaps anyone else in the world, agreed to step in as interim chairman. He flew to New York. He testified before Congress. He sat in front of cameras and reporters and representatives of the federal government and said, with the plain-spoken directness that was the most recognizable feature of his public communication style, that Salomon would cooperate fully with all investigations, that he personally guaranteed that the company's conduct would be above reproach going forward, and that he would personally take responsibility for ensuring that it was. He told his employees something that became one of the most quoted statements in the history of business ethics, that they should lose money for the firm. That would be forgivable, but they should not lose a shred of the firm's reputation. Reputation once lost, he said, was nearly impossible to recover. He stabilized Salomon. He guided it through the crisis. He eventually sold Berkshire's position at a profit. But the episode was notable not for the financial outcome, which was fine, but for what it revealed about the human being underneath the investment genius. Buffett did not abandon a company when it was in trouble. He showed up. He stood in front of the cameras and took responsibility for things that were not, strictly speaking, his fault. He did the uncomfortable, unglamorous, exposed work of salvage and rehabilitation with the same methodical patience he brought to the comfortable, private work of picking stocks. This quality, this willingness to be present in difficulty, To absorb reputational risk in service of a commitment he had made was as central to Buffett's character as any investment insight he ever had. And it was not separate from his success. It was integral to it. Because the thing that made it possible for him to attract the kind of long-term, patient, trusting capital that powered Berkshire's compounding engine was precisely this reputation for integrity, for doing what he said, for saying what he meant, for being the same person in public that he was in private. He was not perfect. No one operating at the scale he operated at for as long as he operated could be. He was slow to react to the tech boom of the late 1990s, famously, explicitly, publicly slow, declining to buy technology stocks on the grounds that he did not understand the businesses well enough to predict their cash flows 10 or 20 years in the future. This earned him enormous ridicule during the peak of the dot-com bubble, when it seemed like every tech stock was doubling every 6 months, and the very idea of disciplined value investing seemed as relevant as a horse-drawn carriage on a freeway. Forbes ran pieces questioning whether he had lost his touch. CNBC spent considerable airtime on the question of whether Warren Buffett was obsolete. Then the dot-com crash happened. Between 2000 and 2002, the Nasdaq lost nearly 80% of its value. Dozens of companies that had been worth billions went to zero. The fortunes of the new internet millionaires evaporated with the speed of morning dew. And Berkshire Hathaway, which had missed the entire mania because its chairman had refused to buy things he didn't understand, was largely unscathed. Buffett did not gloat. He rarely gloated about anything. But the episode confirmed, again, one of his deepest convictions, that the most dangerous words in investing were, "This time it's different," and that the person who refused to abandon their principles under the social pressure of a mania was almost always right in the long run, even when they were being loudly, publicly, almost universally told that they were wrong. His personal life through all of this was, by normal standards, genuinely unusual. His marriage to Susan was one of the most unconventional in public life. They were deeply connected. She was his emotional center, his interpreter of the human world, the person who could read a room the way Warren read a balance sheet. But the marriage evolved, over time, into something different from conventional spousal partnership. In 1977, Susan moved to San Francisco to pursue a singing career, performing in local clubs, nurturing the musical life that had always been central to her identity, but that Omaha had not quite been able to accommodate. The marriage did not formally end. They remained genuinely close. They traveled together. They appeared together publicly. But they lived separately, and Susan introduced Warren, with characteristic thoughtfulness, to a woman named Astrid Manx, who became his companion in Omaha for the next 3 decades. This arrangement was not a secret. It was simply, in the Buffett fashion, not a subject he considered appropriate for public discussion. The three of them, Warren, Susan, Astrid, sent Christmas cards together, signed with all 3 names. People who knew them well considered the arrangement, however unconventional, genuinely loving on all sides. Susan said, on more than one occasion, that she had simply decided that Warren needed more emotional management than any one person could reasonably provide. This may have been the most precise and economical description of Warren Buffett's emotional constitution ever offered by anyone. Susan Buffett died in July 2004 of a stroke while on vacation in Cody, Wyoming. She was 72. Warren was devastated in a way that he was not equipped, by temperament or training, to express publicly, but that those close to him saw clearly in the months that followed. She had been the emotional architecture of his life for more than 50 years, and her absence was a loss that no amount of financial success or public admiration could reduce or replace. He married Astrid Manx in 2006, on his 76th birthday, in a small ceremony at his daughter Susie's house. He said it felt right. He said it was long overdue. He said, with the combination of understatement and precision that characterized everything he communicated, that Astrid had been taking care of him for 30 years, and he thought he should probably make it official. But it was in 2006, just months before the wedding, that Warren Buffett made an announcement that genuinely shocked the financial world. Not because it involved a market position or a business acquisition. Those would have been expected, even if surprising in their details. It shocked the world because it was personal, and because it was unprecedented, and because it revealed something about the man that all of his annual letters and public speeches and decades of interviews had only partially illuminated. He announced that he would give away approximately 85% of his Berkshire Hathaway shares, at the time, worth roughly $37 billion, to philanthropic foundations. The largest share, roughly $30 billion at the time of announcement, would go to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The rest would go to foundations run by his 3 children and the foundation named for Susan. In a single announcement, Warren Buffett had committed the largest charitable gift in human history, larger than any Rockefeller donation, larger than any Carnegie endowment, larger, by a significant margin, than anything ever given by any individual human being to charitable causes. And his explanation for this decision was, in the Buffett tradition, utterly without pretension or performance. He said that his children had been given enough to do anything they wanted with their lives, but not so much that they could do nothing. He said that the Gates Foundation was better equipped to deploy capital for maximum humanitarian benefit than he was, that global health and education were not his areas of expertise, and that the discipline he had applied to finding the best businesses to own should also be applied to finding the best philanthropic organizations to fund. He said that the wealth he had accumulated had been the product not merely of his own talent and effort, but of the American system, of the infrastructure, the rule of law, the market economy, the culture of financial sophistication, that had made it possible for someone to spend his life doing what he loved and be extraordinarily rewarded for it. He had won, as he put it, the ovarian lottery. He had been born in the right place, at the right time, with the right aptitudes for the particular moment in human history in which he happened to find himself. And he believed that this was a reason for gratitude and generosity, not merely a justification for private accumulation. This was not radical altruism. It was not self-flagellation or guilt. It was something characteristically Buffett, a rational analysis of where he could create the most value, combined with a genuine and deeply felt sense of responsibility to something larger than his own balance sheet. And it changed the philanthropy landscape permanently. Together with the Gates Foundation, which he joined as a trustee, he became a co-founder of something called the Giving Pledge, an initiative asking the wealthiest people in the world to commit to donating the majority of their wealth to philanthropy during their lifetimes or at their deaths. Hundreds of the world's billionaires have since signed. The 2008 financial crisis was another moment that revealed the Buffett psychology with perfect clarity. As the entire global financial system careened toward collapse, as Lehman Brothers failed, as banks stopped trusting each other, as credit markets froze, as fear swept through every corner of the financial universe, Warren Buffett did something that had been his signature move for 7 decades. He invested $5 billion in Goldman Sachs at the absolute nadir of the crisis, receiving preferred stock with a 10% dividend and warrants to buy Goldman common stock at favorable prices. It was, in the most literal sense, a bet that the financial system would survive, a public statement of confidence at precisely the moment when confidence was rarest and therefore most valuable. He made a similar investment in General Electric. He invested in Wrigley's, in conjunction with Mars's acquisition. He deployed billions of dollars of Berkshire's capital into the market during the darkest months of the global financial meltdown. He published an op-ed in the New York Times on October 16, 2008, titled Buy American. I Am. In it, he explained, with the characteristic clarity of a man who had thought about these things for 60 years, that he was moving his personal portfolio entirely into American equities, that the fears driving the market down were real but temporary, while the underlying value of American businesses was real and permanent, and that the prices on offer during a panic were exactly the prices you wanted to see if you were a disciplined, rational buyer with a long-time horizon. The article was, in retrospect, almost a perfect market timing call. The market was within weeks of its absolute bottom and would recover to make extraordinary new highs over the following decade. The Goldman investment alone made Berkshire approximately $3.5 billion in profit. The returns on the crisis investments collectively were among the best single-period returns Berkshire had ever generated. Not because Buffett had predicted the crash, he hadn't. Not because he had some special access to information that other investors lacked, he didn't. But because he had spent his entire career building the psychological and financial architecture needed to act rationally during irrational moments. He had cash. He had patience. He had the emotional stability to be genuinely calm when the world was genuinely panicking. And he had the intellectual framework, built over 60 years of study and practice, to know, with confidence, what things were worth when the market was screaming that they were worth nothing. This is the great paradox of Warren Buffett. The simplicity is real. The simplicity is genuine. Buy great businesses at fair prices and hold them forever. Don't pay for what you can't understand. Don't borrow more than you need. Keep cash available for opportunities. Be patient. Be rational. Be honest. These are not complicated instructions. They are available to anyone willing to listen. He has been saying them in public, in plain English, for 60 years. And yet almost nobody actually does it. Almost nobody can. Because the principles sound simple, but the execution requires a psychological fortitude, a capacity for rational independence in the face of overwhelming social pressure. That is, in practice, vanishingly rare. When the market is going up and everyone around you is getting rich on investments you don't understand, the simple principle of only buy what you understand becomes an almost unbearable act of self-denial. When the market is crashing and every headline is announcing the end of capitalism, the simple principle of buy when others are fearful requires a genuine, unconditional trust in your own judgment at precisely the moment when your judgment is being assailed from every direction. Warren Buffett can do these things. He has always been able to do these things. Not because he is superhuman. He will tell you himself, with evident sincerity, that he is not. But because the wiring is different. The emotional response to market fluctuations that most people experience as anxiety is, in Buffett, experienced as something closer to opportunity assessment. He does not feel fear in the way that most investors feel fear. He feels the same information, prices falling, losses mounting, uncertainty increasing, and processes it through a framework so deeply ingrained that it has become, at this point, simply how he sees the world. The Apple investment is perhaps the most remarkable illustration of this evolved Buffett. In 2016, Berkshire began buying Apple stock. This was, on its face, an apparent contradiction. Buffett had spent decades saying he didn't understand technology companies well enough to invest in them. Apple was, by any conventional definition, a technology company. The contradiction was immediately noted by everyone watching Berkshire's position disclosures. But Buffett explained it with characteristic precision. Apple, he said, was not a technology company in the sense he had previously avoided. It was a consumer products company, more specifically, a consumer franchise company, with competitive advantages so deeply embedded in the behavioral habits of its customers that the barriers to switching were, for practical purposes, nearly absolute. He didn't understand what was inside the iPhone. He understood what people were willing to pay for it, what they would sacrifice to keep it, how the brand made them feel, and what those things implied about the company's pricing power and earnings durability for the next 10 to 20 years. He was thinking about See's candies. He was thinking about the lesson Munger had taught him 60 years earlier about what really constituted competitive advantage. He was thinking, as he always thought, about franchise value, about the invisible, unaccountable, almost magical force of genuine customer loyalty and what it was worth when properly capitalized. And he had found those qualities in a technology company, of all things, in a way that he was finally confident he understood well enough to act on. Berkshire Hathaway's Apple stake eventually grew to be worth more than $100 billion, the single most profitable investment Berkshire had ever made. A position that represented a substantial fraction of Apple's total market capitalization. A position built in a company that most technology analysts would never have identified as Buffett's type of investment, but that Buffett had correctly identified as, at its core, exactly the kind of consumer franchise he had been buying his entire career. The number is worth sitting with. $100 billion. From a single investment. Made by a man in his mid-80s, sitting in an office in Omaha, Nebraska, reading annual reports and drinking cherry Coke. The story of Warren Buffett is sometimes told as a story about money. It is that. It is the greatest money story in the history of investment. But it is also something more than that, and something more interesting. It is a story about the relationship between character and success, about how the particular combination of intellectual qualities and psychological qualities and life experiences that shaped a specific human being in a specific place at a specific time in history produced capabilities that no amount of formal training or institutional advantage could replicate. It is a story about patience in a culture that celebrates speed, about simplicity in a world of complexity, about doing one thing extremely well rather than many things adequately, about knowing what you don't know with the same precision that you know what you do, about the willingness to look foolish in the short run in service of being right in the long run, about sitting still in Omaha while the financial world spins and churns and invents and collapses and reinvents itself, and trusting that the principles you understood at 11 years old, that businesses have real value, that markets misprice things, that patience earns compound returns, are as true today as they were when you were reading them from a book your father brought to your hospital bed. There is something almost mythological about the figure Warren Buffett has become. He is the sage of Omaha, the oracle, the greatest capital allocator in human history, titles that have accreted around him over decades of performance that any single superlative struggles to adequately describe. He has become, in the American cultural imagination, something more than an investor. He is a moral figure, a teacher, a living argument for the proposition that integrity and success are not in conflict, that being honest, being patient, being genuine, and being brilliant can all coexist in the same human being and produce results that would not have been possible if any of those qualities had been compromised. He holds court every year in Omaha. The Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting, known affectionately as Woodstock for capitalists, draws tens of thousands of shareholders and admirers from around the world to the Chi Health Center Arena in downtown Omaha. They come from Tokyo and London and Sao Paulo and Sydney, filing in with the quiet excitement of people who understand that what they are about to witness is genuinely unrepeatable. They come to hear Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger, until Munger's death in November 2023, at the age of 99, answer questions from shareholders for 5, 6, 7 hours. Not scripted questions carefully filtered by a communications team. Real questions, sometimes sharp and uncomfortable, from real investors who want real answers. And Buffett gives them, every time, in that flat Midwestern voice that carries the authority of someone who has simply thought about these things more carefully and for longer than anyone else in the room. He is funny. He is humble about his mistakes in a way that makes the humility feel earned rather than performed. He tells stories. He explains complex ideas through plain analogies that stick in your mind for years afterward. He treats the people in those seats not as an audience to be managed, but as partners to be respected, and they feel it. And they keep coming back year after year because the feeling does not go stale. They come not primarily for financial tips, though the financial wisdom on display is extraordinary. They come because there is something genuinely rare in the modern world about a person who has done something at the highest possible level for the longest possible time and remained, in every discernible way, himself, who has not been corrupted by wealth, who has not been inflated by fame, who has not disappeared behind the security apparatus and the institutional distance that separate most billionaires from ordinary human contact. He still lives in the house he bought in 1958 for $31,500 on Farnham Street in Omaha. He still drives himself to work. He still stops at McDonald's on the way. The amount he spends depending, by his own account, on how the market feels that morning. $2.95 for a bacon, egg, and cheese biscuit on good days. $2.61 for a sausage McMuffin on cautious days. He still plays bridge online for hours. He still reads 500 pages a day. He still thinks the same thoughts he has always thought, applies the same framework he has always applied, and produces, year after year, results that defy the standard assumptions about what is possible for a person or an organization to achieve over time. There will never be another Warren Buffett. This is not false modesty or premature eulogizing. It is the considered judgment of virtually everyone who has studied investing seriously. The combination of factors that produced him, the particular family, the particular city, the particular era, the particular intellectual framework discovered at the particular moment of maximum receptivity, the particular psychological architecture that made patience and rationality not merely principles but instincts. These things do not recombine in the same way twice. The universe does not run the same experiment twice. What can be learned from him is not how to replicate his specific results. Nobody is going to build another Berkshire Hathaway by following Buffett's playbook in the 21st century. What can be learned is something about the relationship between character and achievement that is genuinely transferable. The primacy of patience. The discipline of genuine understanding over fashionable conviction. The courage to be wrong in the short run in service of being right in the long run. The compounding of trust and reputation over decades, and the extraordinary returns that compound eventually generates. The value of knowing who you are, and where you belong, and what you love, and then simply, stubbornly, gloriously refusing to be anything else. A boy in Omaha, reading about ways to make $1,000. A young man on a Saturday train to Washington, knocking on a locked office door because he wanted to understand a company that his idol had decided was worth owning. A husband and a father and a partner and a friend who made $100 billion investment from the same office where he made his first trade. A man who gave most of his fortune away not because he had to, not because it made strategic sense, but because he believed, simply, genuinely, in the way he believed that price and value were different things, that it was right. There is a moment, in the great flow of this story, that seems to crystallize everything. It is not a moment of enormous financial triumph, though those moments exist in abundance. It is a quieter moment. A winter morning in Omaha. The streets are empty. The cold comes off the Missouri River and moves through the flat Nebraska landscape with the unhurried authority of something that has been doing this for a very long time and intends to keep doing it. The city is waking up slowly, the way Midwestern cities do, without drama, without spectacle, and in a house on Farnham Street, not far from the house where his father used to bring him to the office on Saturdays and let him sit in the corner and watch the ticker tape. An old man is reading. He has been reading since he woke up, the way he has been reading every morning for 70 years. Financial reports, newspapers, business histories, the raw material from which his understanding of the world has been continuously built and rebuilt and refined. He is drinking a cherry Coke. He is making notes in the margins. He is, by every external measure, doing exactly what he was doing when he was 11 years old. He is the richest investor in human history. He is also, in the most important sense, the same boy who stood in his father's brokerage office and fell in love with the idea that numbers could tell you the truth about the world, If only you were willing to pay attention long enough to hear what they were saying. He is still paying attention. He always was. End of script. There is an investment that sits at the very center of the Berkshire Hathaway legend. One so well known that it has become almost a cliché, and yet whose full story is so extraordinary that it bears retelling with the care it deserves. In 1988, Warren Buffett began quietly buying shares of the Coca-Cola Company. He did this with characteristic secrecy, accumulating the position over months, through multiple brokers, trying to avoid tipping his hand to a market that would instantly drive up the price if it knew Berkshire was buying. By the time he was finished, Berkshire owned approximately 10% of Coca-Cola, roughly 1.02 billion shares, purchased for a total of roughly $1.3 billion. The financial world was divided in its reaction. Some observers saw it immediately as a masterstroke. Others were skeptical. Coca-Cola was not an obscure, overlooked company. It was one of the most famous and widely analyzed companies on Earth. If Coca-Cola was undervalued, surely someone would have noticed before now. What did Buffett see that the rest of the market was missing? The answer requires understanding something about how Warren Buffett thought about consumer franchise businesses by this point in his career. Coca-Cola had spent the previous century building something that simply could not be replicated. It was not the formula. The formula, despite the famous secrecy around it, was not what Coca-Cola was really selling. What Coca-Cola was selling was a feeling, a specific, precise, universally recognizable emotional experience associated with the color red and a particular curve of glass and a specific sweetness on the tongue that hundreds of millions of people around the world had been conditioned, since childhood, to associate with pleasure and refreshment and a particular quality of moment. You could spend $10 billion trying to create a competitor to that feeling, and you could not do it, because the feeling was not a product. It was a cultural artifact, built over a century of consistent, ubiquitous presence, reinforced by associations, with sport, with music, with celebration, with the simple, ordinary goodness of a cold drink on a hot day, that had penetrated the human imagination at a depth that no advertising budget could reach from outside. This was a moat in the truest sense, not a moat of patents or technology or exclusive contracts. Those things expire or can be circumvented. A moat of culture, of memory, of the deeply grooved human habit of wanting what you have always wanted because it is what you have always wanted. Coca-Cola's competitive advantage was, essentially, the entire history of human association with the brand, accumulated drop by drop over 100 years, and it was renewing itself continuously because every child who grew up drinking Coke became an adult who drank Coke and would, in time, introduce their children to Coke. The compounding was not financial. It was cultural, and its durability was, for practical purposes, infinite. Buffett had also done something that most analysts had not. He had studied the trajectory of Coca-Cola's international business. America was mature, growth was limited, competition was entrenched. But the world outside America was still, in 1988, a place where hundreds of millions of people were just beginning to experience the kind of disposable income that made a cold Coca-Cola an accessible pleasure rather than a luxury. China, India, Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, Latin America, markets with populations measured in the billions, where Coke was available but not yet ubiquitous, and where the rising tide of economic development was going to make it ubiquitous, and where once it became ubiquitous it would become that same grooved cultural habit, and the machine would compound again, globally, at rates that dwarfed what the American market alone could produce. He bought $1.3 billion of Coca-Cola stock. By 2023, that stake was worth over $25 billion and had paid out billions more in dividends along the way. The yield on his original cost basis, the dividend income as a percentage of what he had paid, had grown to rates that made the original investment look, in retrospect, almost incomprehensibly cheap. And through all the years between 1988 and today, Through all the market cycles and recessions and panics and booms and technological revolutions and geopolitical upheavals that might have given a less certain investor cause to reconsider, Buffett never sold a share. Not one. Not when the market crashed in 2000. Not when it crashed in 2008. Not when Pepsi looked like a serious competitive threat, or when health concerns about sugar consumption seemed to cloud Coke's future, or when every contrarian in the financial press was writing pieces about whether the brand was losing relevance to a new generation of consumers. He held, because the thesis had not changed. The moat was still there. The culture was still there. The habit was still there. And the compounding machine was still running. There is a second story that is equally instructive, and it is in some ways more personal. In 1976, Geico, the government employees' insurance company, which Buffett had first visited as a 20-year-old in Washington and which had lodged itself in his analytical mind as a genuinely extraordinary business, was in serious trouble. Geico had built its business on a direct-to-consumer model for automobile insurance, selling policies directly to customers by mail and phone, without the army of commissioned agents that its competitors relied on. This eliminated the agent cost and allowed Geico to offer rates significantly below the competition. It was a structural advantage of extraordinary power, and for decades it had made Geico one of the most profitable insurance companies in America. But in the early 1970s, Geico had done something that nearly destroyed it. Under pressure to grow, the company had expanded its underwriting, had begun writing policies on riskier classes of drivers in states with more difficult regulatory environments, at prices that did not adequately reflect the actual risk being taken on. The actuarial models were wrong, or had been applied carelessly, or both. When the claims came in, they came in at rates that the premiums collected could not cover. Losses mounted. Reserves were depleted. The stock, which had been trading above $40, collapsed toward $2. The financial press was writing Geico's obituary. Buffett started buying. He had done this kind of analysis before, had looked at a business that was temporarily impaired and asked the fundamental question, is the core franchise still intact? Is the underlying business model, stripped of its current problems, genuinely exceptional? Is the thing that made this company great still there, waiting to reemerge once the current management has been replaced and the bad book of business has been worked off? In Geico's case, the answer was unambiguously yes. The direct-to-consumer model was not broken. The cost advantage was not gone. The brand was not permanently damaged. The company had made bad underwriting decisions and was paying for them. But bad decisions could be corrected, bad policies could be allowed to expire, new management could be brought in with stricter disciplines. The moat was still there. The machine was still intact. It just needed to be restarted by people who understood what they were doing. He bought Geico shares at prices between $2 and $7. He watched as the company, under new management and with new discipline, stabilized its underwriting and gradually returned to profitability. He watched the stock recover. He continued buying. By the time Berkshire acquired the remaining half of Geico that it did not already own, in 1996, the company was one of the fastest-growing insurance companies in America. The acquisition price was $2.3 billion, a number that seemed large at the time, and that would look increasingly modest with every passing year as Geico grew into one of the most profitable components of the Berkshire Empire. The Geico story is the Buffett story in miniature. It is the story of someone who understood a business so thoroughly and trusted his understanding so completely that he could act when everyone else was running away. And the courage to act in those moments, the courage that is really not courage at all, but simply the product of knowledge deep enough to banish fear, was not something Warren Buffett had learned from Benjamin Graham or Charlie Munger or any book or any teacher. It was something he had been born with and had spent his entire life cultivating, and that expressed itself, again and again, at precisely the moments when it mattered most. There is a principle he articulated that has become, in the decades since, perhaps the most quoted single statement in the entire literature of investment. He said it first in the early 1990s, and he has said it many times since, in many formulations. The core of it is this: be fearful when others are greedy, and greedy when others are fearful. This sounds like a fortune cookie. It sounds like the kind of thing you put on a motivational poster and hang in a financial advisor's waiting room. But it is not a platitude. It is a precise description of a specific psychological discipline that almost no human being can actually execute under real conditions. Because the conditions that trigger others are greedy are exactly the conditions that make you feel most confident and most excited and most inclined to join the party, and the conditions that trigger others are fearful are exactly the conditions that make every instinct you have scream at you to sell and run and protect yourself and never, ever buy anything until things have calmed down. To execute this principle is not merely to understand it intellectually. It requires a neurological architecture so different from the norm that it functions, in effect, as a different kind of mind. Buffett's mind does not work the way most people's minds work when it comes to financial risk. Most people feel market volatility as threat. Buffett feels it as price change, sometimes in the favorable direction, sometimes not. The emotional charge of the crisis is simply absent. What remains is the analytical question: has the value of the underlying business changed? If yes, what is it now worth? If not, and the price has dropped, has a buying opportunity been created? These questions are cold and clear and answerable, and they are answered quickly by a mind trained to answer them and undistorted by the emotional weather that prevents most people from thinking clearly during exactly the moments when clear thinking is most valuable. This is the rarest gift in investing. And it is, in the end, what Warren Buffett is. He is not a magician. He is not the beneficiary of information others don't have. He is not lucky. Or rather, he is lucky in the way that all truly exceptional people are lucky, which is to say that his luck consists primarily of having been born with certain qualities at a certain time, in a certain place, that combined to produce a career that would not have been possible in any other configuration. He was lucky to be born in America, lucky to be born in Omaha, lucky to have had a father who let him sit in the office, lucky to have encountered Benjamin Graham's work at the exact moment of maximum receptivity, lucky to have met Charlie Munger, lucky to have married Susan Thompson, lucky that the compounding machine he built had enough time, enough decades, to do its work. But within the range of human luck, the choices were his. The discipline was his. The patience, extraordinary, almost inhuman patience, the patience of a man who could hold a stock for 40 years while the financial press speculated every 5 minutes about whether he had finally, this time, made a mistake. That patience was entirely, uniquely, irreducibly his. He is 94 years old as of this telling. He is still in the office. He is still reading. He is still managing Berkshire Hathaway, which he has made clear is the permanent home of his working life. That he has no intention of retiring, no ambition beyond continuing to do what he has always done, which is to find great businesses at fair prices and own them for as long as their greatness endures. And he is still, improbably and beautifully and in defiance of every reasonable expectation, getting better at it, still refining his thinking, still incorporating new frameworks, still updating his mental model of the world with the voracious curiosity of someone who has been doing this for 70 years and has not yet encountered the question that made him feel he already knew everything he needed to know. The Coca-Cola in his hand, sweating in the Omaha summer, is both symbol and substance, a product he understands so well that he has owned it for decades, from a company he analyzed so thoroughly that its price fluctuations have never once given him cause for genuine concern, enjoyed with the simple pleasure of a man who knows what he likes and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. It is, in its modest way, the whole philosophy in a can. Buy what is great. Understand it completely. Pay a fair price. Hold it forever. And enjoy what you're doing. Because if you don't enjoy it, you won't do it well, and if you don't do it well, all the theory in the world won't save you. Warren Buffett has enjoyed it. Every day, for every year, since the boy in Jamaica, Queen sat in the corner of his father's brokerage and watched the ticker tape and felt the world click into focus for the first time. He is still watching. He always will be.